So if you increase from 77 to 100 or 110 or 150, there's no additional effect. And so that's really the crux of this analysis, is that most of the places where the hydraulic fracturing is happening, like the core areas of the Belridge oil fields, are high well density with or without hydraulic fracturing.
Keep going. If you want.
I'll pass it back to Preston.
Okay, all right. So we had a recommendation to minimize habitat loss and fragmentation within the fields. There are some technologies that can allow that, such as directional drilling, so that wells could be clustered, say, on a particular pad, so there isn't so much surface disturbance. And this could be coordinated through regional plans that require and designate certain habitat to be conserved and or trade-offs to be made, so that if a certain area is going to be disturbed, there's a requirement to set aside other areas, as well as maintaining corridors between critical habitats so that species populations can remain connected. So we've talked already a lot about data and knowledge gaps. I'll first talk about some data reporting gaps we found. These are just examples, but for instance, a lot of the information about the wells, while Dogger has the information, it's not readily available in a searchable format, meaning I or another researcher can't say, show me all the wells in this area that are deeper than 2,000 meters. They don't have a database that allows that searching currently. As Dr. Stringfellow mentioned, some operators told us that the data that they've submitted in the past regarding how they dispose of produced water is inaccurate. So we know that the public data has inaccuracies in it that affect our understanding of the state of the system. So recommendations, not too surprisingly, is to implement data quality assurance and control, and in the future, as well as past, to put that data into a database that is searchable and usable by the public and researchers both. As far as knowledge gaps, I mentioned the location and depth and quality of groundwater, the distribution of groundwater quality. We don't have good statistics on well integrity, so I can bring the province of Alberta in Canada as an example. The regulatory agency there has required and then put into a database data on methane leakage from wells. And so they're able to say that about 5% of the wells in Alberta have a detectable leak of methane. And that is probably some information that might be useful to have in the California context. And then Dr. Stringfellow mentioned seismicity and disposal injections. We have such a high level of background seismicity here that we were not able, as a part of this study, to do the definitive correlation analysis of looking at water injection and seismicity, so we'd recommend that that be done as well. And then finally, establishing a scientific advisory committee might be helpful going forward, so that as issues come up, they can be addressed. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. It's been a real privilege to be able to present this information to you. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them.
Be careful. And we're going to have several questions, and let's see if we can keep this to about 15 minutes on the questions, so we have adequate time for the response by the Department of Conservation and State Water Board. Senator Jackson.
Thank you.
Any
yes.
of these three or all of the above?
I will try to be brief because it seems very clear to me from this discussion that there's a lot we don't know. And because we don't know it, we cannot reach conclusions that will be helpful as we try to address these concerns in the future. So I would like to just ask you if you would just briefly summarize those issues that we don't know. There were some questions you indicated earlier on in your respective testimonies that there's a lot of data that we don't have, that we've either not been able to collect or that the oil industry hasn't provided, whether it's because they just don't want to or they're not required to. These are the kinds of things that I think we need to be able to identify as policymakers so we can fill in those gaps and so we can know what it is we need to know in order to protect the public. My particular concern, as I hear you, if I'm not mistaken in summary of the testimony, is that our real concerns here are with our groundwater and the injection of produced water into various aquifers or groundwater disposal or percolation pits and all this kind of thing. But we don't really know enough to be able to give guidance to what we should be doing for going forward. So I was wondering if you might be able to sort of summarize those areas that we should know more about that we don't, for whatever reasons, so that we can perhaps give some direction going forward. Would that be
Prioritize some of
Yes,
those main,
correct.
that's a good takeaway question on what are, so priorities for the legislature.
Yeah, and I think you can't necessarily do everything at once. And from the environmental assessment and water point of view and groundwater, I think we really have a very poor understanding. We've gotten a much better understanding of what's being injected, but there's reactions that occur in the subsurface, and we are completely ignorant. After the injection occurs, there's fluids that go in, there's something that comes back, and we really have no information on that. And that's, I would make that a priority, and that's, you know, relates directly to the disposal practices and the other issues that come out of that. So there's a need for understanding the reaction chemistry, what's happening in the subsurface, the interactions between the chemicals and the rocks, and then that will lead directly to what the disposal practices are.
And is that information that could be attainable if we were to direct that it be provided?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to support some science on that. I think it's not necessarily off the shelf. You can't just say go to an you know, some of the techniques for measurements haven't been developed, and we need to, you know, I think they're not developed in a routine basis. You can do it in a scientific environment and then try to set the parameters for what the measurements ought to be, and then you can institutionalize those measurements as part of the routine monitoring programs.
Thank you.
And I would just add the environmental profiles, which you've already heard about, you know, requiring environmental profiles for all the chemicals that are used. In terms of seismicity, the current data that's available is month by month, and the seismologists, of which I'm not, but the seismologists at Lawrence Berkeley Lab say they really need produced water injection data and regarding pressures and volumes on a finer time step, so daily if possible. That basically having it on a monthly time step is too long a time period to be able to do good correlation studies with seismicity. And there are, I mean, I guess I would note there, in terms of understanding the whole water system, hopefully the data that comes from SB 1281 will provide a clearer and more accurate picture. But I guess I would emphasize the need that as more data comes in, there's an ongoing process of assessment analysis, so you can get the most out of the data that you've requested over time.
I think Preston brings up something really important, which is that our report came very quickly after SB4 and its reporting requirements and SB 1281. The quality of information available on a number of topics is improving, and reinvestigating some of these same questions in another year or two could possibly yield more insight.
Okay, Senator Allen?
On those lines, I just, could you, you know, one of the recommendations you gave, recommendation 1.1, had to do with identifying opportunities for water conservation and reuse in the oil and gas industry, and you talked about an assessment of the data that we have regarding the water used in fracking operations. And I guess one of the things I want to get a better sense of what kind of data will we get about the quality of the water that's either reused or, you know, disposed of in the aquifers. So is there when you talk about putting some more research, more emphasis into the science, more investment into the science, are we going to get meaningful information about the water quality coming out of SB 1281?
Right? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with what the reporting requirements are for pursuant to that, but the kind of information that I think would be helpful is, for instance, we found a case looking at those fields where hydraulic fracturing takes place, where there's some fields that are taking in what is characterized as fresh water and then using it for enhanced oil recovery. And then there's other fields nearby where they're disposing of fresh water, what's characterized as fresh water in injection wells. And there may be very good reason why those aren't matched up. It may be that there's something about the quality of the water that's being disposed in one field that it can't be used for the enhanced soil recovery in the other field. But we think that at that system level, that's something that could be explored by the state, because it may be that there's legal or operational boundaries between the different field operators that could be overcome that would allow that handoff of this operator's producing water that could be used by this operator, and that would reduce the overall demand on the water supply system, if you will. So I don't know if the data from SB 1281 will get us to that point or not, because I'm not as familiar with the reporting on that, but that's part of what we had in mind about sort of a water system study.
So that we sure could incentivize that. I mean, many of these operations say that they use recycled water. I mean, do you see any reason why you could not, why the industry could not provide all of its operations from recycled water instead of using freshwater sources or beneficial use of water?
I should be clear that the vast majority of water that is used for enhanced soil recovery is recycled water. But there are some instances where, at least according to the publicly available data, there is supplied water being taken in, or there is fresh water being taken in and used. There are some reasons for that. It's the quality of the water interacts with the water that's actually in the formation or in the zone where the oil is. And depending upon the contrasting chemistry, you can get some negative effects. If you inject the wrong kind of water into a zone, you can start to get minerals precipitating out and other negative effects. So there is some geochemical complexity there. And that's why we think, it's worthy of study. I mean, there may be good reasons why they're doing what they're doing, or it may be, like I say, some operational barrier, legal barrier that's causing that to occur.
And do you have other suggestions of how that we comply with your water conservation recommendation? I mean, in the field of water, we hear it all the time. Even in the middle of drought, everybody says, oh, how we use water isn't a big impact on the state. So look at that guy, how much he's water using, not at me, right? But if you break down all uses of water in the state, it's going to be a small percentage. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be conserving water through every means that we can. So do you have other ways that you could drill down, so to speak, in telling us how to accomplish that recommendation?
Well, I think there's an interest on developing appropriate treatment technologies so that the water can be reused for various purposes. And for that, so in terms from a legislative point of view, I think it's important to put in appropriate barriers where you're just not, you've got to find the sweet point where you're not putting up so many barriers that people just won't try, and to find appropriate room for people to make novel attempts at water purification and reuse, and having a structure that allows that to occur. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I think everything's solved by more research. So, I'm trying to think of an answer that doesn't say that, but there are, there's a lot of interest from industry on water reuse and recycling. I think part of what's important is to get things in a public forum where the trust factor can go up and look at. So there's a way to treat this water. It's really comes to a matter of costs. Technically I could do a bench top and get you pure water out of almost anything, but it's what it costs on the long and maintenance of the reaction system.
We're just trying to track in 1281 where the water is coming from, because the concept was, like Assemblymember Williams was suggesting, anytime we can use recycled water versus clean potable drinking water, that's the preference.
I guess, just to follow up on this, I mean, there was another recommendation in here that talked about how operators ought to offer adequate assurances that the water that's being, fracking operations will not extend into protected aquifers. And I guess, so given the vagueness of our understanding of the water quality issues and perhaps the permeability, what does that look like to you from a policy recommendation perspective if we're gonna ask the operators to provide us with adequate assurance, and this is recommendation 5.1, that the expected fractures will not extend into these aquifers and cause contamination? What does that look like logistically or verbally? I mean, what sort of assurances would we be looking for that, because I think everyone here is very concerned about the extent to which this activity impacts water.
Can I start with that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So from my point of view, in looking at groundwater protection, is a lot of the regulations are developed around this ADSA idea, that there's a zone of influence of these fracturing, and then there's a safety factor of 2 to 5 that's added onto that. And what I think would be a good first step is to establish how are the industry groups calculating that ADSA, make sure it's very transparent, and that it's
ADSA is what?
It's
Axial dimensional stimulation area. So this is in the regulations that Division of Oil and Gas has put forward. It's basically, you can just think of it as the size, the intended size of the fracture, length, width, height.
the volume, yeah. So do you have that area, so you fracture the well, there's this ADSA, and that's calculated. And then there's a safety factors put on that. But how that ADSA is calculated is not particularly transparent, and it is, to my knowledge, it has not been really vetted in a scientific forum, in an open forum, say, is this really the appropriate way to look at this? And then, I'm not sure that answered the question.
I'm just trying to get a better sense. When you're suggesting to us that the operators who are proposing to use hydraulic fracturing near protected groundwater resources should provide to us adequate, the words that was used, adequate assurances. I'm just trying to get a sense, from a policy perspective, how we would draft that sort of requirement in a way that would
Sure, adequate assurance.
yeah, right, that would adequately assure us that.
Something might be a little clearer is that my understanding from talking to industry people is there's a lot of barriers to them releasing information. So they may have studies, these so-called microseismic studies or other information, and because of the mandated competition between the oil companies, there's apparently barriers for them to be able to release this information. So it might be worth, I couldn't answer directly how to put that into a legislative idea, but the idea of providing opportunities or requirements for release of information that the oil industry collects. They have to collect it. They're in a business. They're pretty smart about what they're doing, but that information is kind of held as internal information. And I'm not sure.
It's a trade secret.
Yeah, and I think also there's very strict rules that I don't exactly understand. When oil industry people are talking to each other, they're not allowed to talk about certain things. So, but if you go to meetings with the guys
for antitrust.
Between each other, yeah. That there are lawyers in the room, and if somebody starts talking about something, they say, well, you're not allowed to talk about that. So that might be something to look at.
I had one question before we switch to the next group, and if you could articulate, please, the importance of your recommendation on phasing out percolation ponds. You did talk a little bit about the trade-offs on underground injection wells, but the importance, there's 900 of them, maybe starting with the ones that are in close proximity to groundwater basins. But could you just highlight for me why that's important? Or if it's
I have a strong opinion on that, so let's talk what the committee's opinion is on this.
So I think one of the key references was a study that took place in Texas and Ohio, and it found that a fairly high proportion of the incidents of groundwater contamination were due to percolation ponds, and as compared to underground injection. So a far higher proportion of groundwater contamination incidents were due to percolation ponds and underground injection. And I don't know if as a consequence of that report or other knowledge, both of those states subsequently phased out percolation ponds in order to protect groundwater. So
that was Ohio and
Texas.
Texas.
Yeah. Now there may be other states as well, but
phased out percolation ponds.
Yeah, and I think Texas phased them out. I mean, the phase out started earlier, but I think they phased them out a couple decades ago.